This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. All this may mean something.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. Well, we haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett and joining me today are two very special guests. First of all, we have friend of the network and regular Primitive Culture contributor. She's the Garrick of this show, I think, Clara Cook. Hi, Clara.
Hi, Duncan.
And today we're also joined by Guinevere Nell from the Briar patch. Hi, Gwen.
Hi, Duncan.
And we're meeting in a very exciting location. We're meeting at the prestigious London School of Economics in central London. One for the economists there. And we're here really to mark a special occasion this weekend, which is Human Rights Day. And this was Clara's idea, actually, was that we should do something on human rights in Star Trek and human rights legislation. And the timing sort of worked out that we could do it perfectly, in time for this annual celebration of our human rights. And basically, I thought, since it was Clara who suggested this, I'm going to hand over to Clara to take the reins for this show, because frankly, what I know about human rights could be written probably on the back of an envelope. But I think it should be an interesting discussion anyway. So, Clara, over to you.
Thank you, Duncan. So, actually, you made a good point, which is what we actually know about human rights can be quite vague sometimes, partly because if we have the human rights that we have available to us in a lot of cultures and countries around the world, specifically where we are right now, which is in the UK, which is still in the European Union.
Just about.
Just about. We have the European Convention of Human Rights, and then also there's the British Human Rights Act, and then as Duncan will probably point out at some point, there's also the Human Rights Charter from the UN. Because we're used to experiencing some of these human rights, we take them for granted, we don't think about them every day, and we may not necessarily know all the detail of the legislation. But one thing that we would notice is if we're watching a television show, and I'm talking about Star Trek, we would notice very much when those human rights aren't being shown on screen.
Right, or if there may be even human rights that we don't have protected now, but you do have protected in the Federation. And I would also mention, I guess, the U.S. Constitution, which protects certain rights. It's pretty short, actually. And there are, you have the Bill of Rights in particular that are actually the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, but that protect some of the basic rights. Sometimes rights that, a lot of the rest of the world wouldn't even consider a right, like carrying a gun or forming a militia. But it's another thing to look at, especially because, of course, Star Trek is, from Hollywood, is American.
It's true. And I suppose, certainly for me and probably for you, Clara, coming from a kind of English perspective or a European perspective, I guess that's our idea about these rights is quite different. A lot of people in England are very anti-human rights. Theresa May, the Prime Minister, what would this be, like a few months ago, maybe a bit longer, was very much talking about the leaving Europe as an opportunity to tear up all these European rights, because they see them as kind of getting in the way, as, making life difficult for people. So there is that kind of, whereas in America, you were talking about gun rights, there's this kind of, on the other side of the coin, we have this right, you can't take it away from us, this is this real important entrenched thing, however much to the rest of the world it might seem slightly mad, but that's a right and it cannot be sort of compromised. So these very different attitudes to what these kind of rights mean and whether protecting them is the right thing or not.
Yeah, I think Americans have a certain love for the idea of the Constitution and the idea of America as being created in order to protect the rights of the people, as sort of battling against the evil Britons and breaking away from that and enshrining certain basic human rights, which obviously only applied to a very few people at the beginning and so on. But I think also the right to freedom of speech, the First Amendment, is also really something that Americans really care about a lot, and they do have this particular view of rights, and why they care about them and don't want them infringed at all, and they're sort of enshrined so that if you infringe it a little bit, it's as bad as infringing it completely. Whereas I think in Britain there's a little bit more of an idea of compromise, and freedom of speech is great, but only under some circumstances, not all circumstances. But I think maybe your representation of Theresa May, I would possibly take a little question with. I mean, I think even in America, you have this idea of wanting to protect the rights, but wanting to protect them our way, the American way. And so the European Court of Human Justice, did I say it right? The European Court.
Yeah.
For, anyways, is American presidents, especially Trump, I think, love to snub their nose at it and say, you're not allowed to tell us how to protect rights. And maybe with the whole Brexit thing, there's kind of a new movement here that, we don't want Europe to be telling us how to do human rights. It doesn't necessarily mean we don't care about human rights anymore, or animal rights. And as I understand it, a lot of people in a lot of MPs are actually, really want to protect animal rights at least as much, but they just want to do it in British law.
But there was a controversy recently, which it was one of these things that sort of blew up, and then they seem to have backtracked a bit. But the story anyway was that because we're going through this process at the moment of withdrawing from European legislation and incorporating some of those laws into our own legislation and sort of modifying them at the same time, there was this debate, which is very relevant for Star Trek actually, about animal rights and the idea of whether animals were sentient or not. And the idea was that, when the animal welfare legislation was being incorporated into the British legislation, the idea of animal sentience would be taken out of the equation. Understandably, a lot of people were very angry about that and reacted against that. And they seemed to kind of backtrack on that and said, oh no, we will still recognise that animals are sentient, which is the European position.
Yeah, well, my understanding of it, just from listening for one afternoon to radio and television and discussions on this, I think, again, the idea was that we wanted to do it in British law, and this idea of sentience, I think, was overblown a little bit by the media, from what I heard, that the people who wanted to drop the European version of the bill were actually advocates of the idea of, and they said that, I forget the name of the person who I'm thinking of who was saying this, but he's one of the leading Tories on this issue, debating this bill, and he said that it's the vast majority of British people believe that animals have the same amount of sentience that is protected in the European bill, but it was more of a quibble over certain distinctions in the two bills, but that the British version, if they could do that, rather than accepting the European version, would be at least as strong in terms of actual welfare rights for animals.
I mean, the idea of sentience isn't... I mean, I don't think that this legislation is talking about cats and dogs, pets. It's talking about primarily referring or questioning the sentience of animals that we use in industrial farming and in food production. And if you don't have to consider the sentience or the well-being of an animal that you're going to eat, or you're going to raise to eat, or you're going to raise to, use in some other industrial way, then you can probably have different types of practices which are more money efficient. So what I would ask is, in a world of the future of like Star Trek or the Federation, where you have replicators, and you don't need to farm great swathes of cattle to make hamburgers or steaks or whatever, and where there's enough food for everybody, the efficiency and the money-saving quality of or possibility of mass production of food and farming isn't such an issue. So in that case, all the animals domestic or otherwise, in the Star Trek future should be like having great lives, because they wouldn't be industrially farmed. We wouldn't necessarily need to worry about their sentience. We would say, yeah, well, they can be sentient or not, or whatever. I mean, they can enjoy good lives. So my question is, we're talking about like biological creatures now, but it could be possible that we could very soon in the future be talking about artificial intelligence or engineered creatures or electronic creatures, and that would take us into something in like Star Trek, like in episodes like The Measure of a Man, or I think it's called The Offspring, where Data creates his own child.
Yeah.
So I want to know what you guys thought about those kinds of episodes.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I've always sort of wondered, we have certain characters in Star Trek who've, the Vulcans, for example, being vegetarian. Chakotay supposedly a vegetarian, though not occasionally when they forget about that in the script writing. But, I mean, if everything they're eating is replicated, I mean, there's this issue now with if you can create... there are ways of creating fake meat from the DNA of actual animals. And then there's a sort of question, what's the kind of, if you're a vegetarian or a vegan or whatever, what's the kind of moral status of that product? And is it okay to eat it? It's closer to the idea of replicated meat. So I suppose there is that sort of issue. And certainly they probably don't have factory farming and these kind of worst abuses of animal welfare that we have in the real world. We do see people eating real animals, and we see like the Klingons hunting animals and eating them. We see, I think there's an Enterprise episode where they find the targs on board the ship that they're going to eat. I mean, certainly I think a lot of the arguments, looking into some of the arguments that were used to defend slavery, there are parallels between those and the kind of arguments that are used to defend the exploitation of animals, to do with these questions of, how much these beings are suffering, how much are they like us, are they different from us, and so on. So there is this kind of parallel in the real world between these two different sort of campaigns, different issues, and certainly in the way that Star Trek presents it, some of those issues come through as well.
Yeah, so that's definitely something that is Next Generation is quite concerned about. Also Voyager as well, because they have a member of the crew who isn't, I would say, like a living being, biological living being. He's a hologram. But especially in Next Generation, because we have Data, who is a really interestingly written character. He's full of depth, full of a lot of different characteristics. He's obviously sentient. I guess the only thing that it concerns Starfleet, especially in A Measure of a Man, is that he's not biological. He's an entity that's been created. He's a machine. He can be turned off, as Riker illustrated in that episode, and he also doesn't feel emotions. But it's clear that he is more than just a simple machine, because he does keep Tasha Yar's picture because they were close. He keeps mementos that the colleagues give him, and friends give him. And what struck me as really interesting about the episode is that the crew, Picard and Riker especially, aren't so much concerned. Well, they're not so much concerned about Data because that he is their friend and their comrade. It's partly that, but it's also because as Starfleet officers, they care about human rights. So they care about his intrinsic worth being like protected, if that makes sense. And that's something I wondered if, like, perhaps maybe Starfleet officers and people living in the Federation grew up with or were trained to think about, which is the human rights of people.
Yeah, both, I think. I think that as a Starfleet officer, you're certainly, you have a fundamental obligation to the truth is one of the things they say. And obviously there's the Prime Directive, but I think in there, and I don't know what article it would be, but there's definitely something that talks about humanoid rights or the rights of all sentient beings and so forth. And that's why, when they meet a new alien species, they don't fire first or anything. They obviously try to communicate, try to create diplomatic relations, try to respect their rights. And, for example, if someone's in distress, they answer a distress call. They don't ask whether the alien is, humanoid even or anything like that. They respect the life of that alien. I find it interesting that Data, from the beginning in TNG, Data is respected. Obviously, he's been with Starfleet for a long time, but you get the sense, except for, obviously, in Measure of a Man, you have a scientist or a whatever he's called. I forget. Yeah,
Yeah.
Maddox, but that
Commander Maddox.
what his actual, he works on artificial life, so whatever that's called. So he doesn't respect Data's rights as much, and that seems to come from a sort of a self-interest in his own career, making his own name, that kind of thing. Obviously, he's not looking for profit, but he's looking for the sort of equivalent in the Federation, which is recognition. And that seems to, for him, blind him a bit to Data as being a sentient, intelligent life form. But so everyone else pretty much respects Data as that. But in Voyager, even though in TNG you have a hologram who becomes sentient, right? Even so, by the time you're with Voyager, which is years later, decades later, whatever, from the beginning you see that there's not nearly as much respect for the EMH. And even though he clearly begins to have more of a sentience since he's living, since he's awake all the time, since he's running 24/7 or well, every day anyway. The first person who actually begins to respect him as a human being is not from the Federation at all. It's Cass, right? So I find it interesting. Janeway, over the seasons, it takes her a long time. She has to be, yelled at by Cass, or not yelled at, but talked to by Cass, and she has to even before she respects the EMH at all, the Doctor. But also, then when he does something a bit wrong and he goes off, he violates orders and he goes with the other holograms, that, what he does that is, wrong is, in my opinion, not nearly as morally wrong as what Janeway does in that episode, where she wants to switch off the holograms from the beginning, and even at the end, she only allows the ones that she's come to trust to be able to stay switched on, even though they're running from a race that has no respect for humanoid rights, who consider everybody prey, and who are just much more vicious than even the religious crazy hologram. And what's the episode called for listeners? I forget.
Flesh and Blood?
Flesh and Blood? Yeah, Flesh and Blood. Yeah. What do you think? I mean, it seems to me that Janeway is biased against holograms and towards biological creatures.
Definitely, I think. I mean, compared to Picard, it's interesting. Picard and Data, as you say, from quite early on, Picard has this sort of relationship with Data. He's quite protective of Data and so on. Janeway is, if anything, on Voyager, probably the person who has the least time for the holographic Doctor. Even in, say, in Latent Image, you talked about Kes having a word with her. We have Seven doing the same thing, having a word with her. And it's interesting, some of the same arguments that crop up in Author in the seventh season are reflective of some of the things that happened in Latent Image. So this idea of, is the Doctor more like a replicator? That's exactly what Janeway has said to Seven of Nine, only a couple of years earlier. And then that's what's being said, which she's sort of defending him against. And so by that point, but it's quite a late episode, it's a seventh season episode, we finally get Janeway really kind of going to bat for the Doctor and really kind of defending his rights. But most of the time, it's definitely been a long journey for her to get there, and she's been one of the most sceptical people really on that show about that. I mean, in terms of the Doctor, it's quite interesting. I read an interview once with they'd interviewed both Jerry Taylor and Brannon Braga, and this was while Voyager was running, and they asked them both the same question: is the Doctor alive? And Jerry Taylor said, yeah, of course he is, and Brannon Braga said no. So even in the writers' room there was this kind of discussion about this kind of thing that gets talked about in The Measure of a Man as well. Is it just that with these holograms that we mistakenly sort of put this humanity onto them, that we anthropomorphise them? They talk about that. And in The Measure of a Man, I'm not sure if this is in the original cut or in the extended edition, but there's a discussion between Riker and Troy where Riker says to her, do you feel anything from Data? And she says no. And obviously there's this idea that Data doesn't have emotions. And she basically says, it is possible that we're putting all this onto him, and that he does, that there isn't anything there in a sense. And at the end of that episode, the judge says, I can't rule whether Data has a soul or not. But then she says, but I don't know whether I have a soul or not. And, and Picard earlier has said to Maddox, go on then, prove to me that I'm sentient, because you can't do it, Right. So it's this kind of, there's this essence of uncertainty, I suppose, about these issues at some level. And really it becomes, I don't know, almost like a kind of a leap of faith or a kind of gesture of faith to say, well, at the very least, we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt, And in that Exocomp episode as well, there's this kind of idea, well, there's a long time where they're saying, well, we're not sure, we don't know. But if we don't know, it's wrong to exploit these beings if they may be sentient or they may have feelings about it. And I suppose it also ties into this idea of emotions, because, one of the reasons that people have often given for exploiting animals is, they don't feel suffering the way we do. They don't have emotions the way we do. And that's, very debatable. If you look at the way animals react, say, a mother cow reacts when the calf is taken away from them, they exhibit what I would say is a very clear emotional response. But we like this idea that animals don't have emotions as we understand them, because it justifies treating them that way. Now, obviously, with Data, allegedly at least, he doesn't have emotions. Until he plugs in that emotion chip, he doesn't give off any emotions. And therefore, does that mean he doesn't have the same kind of subjective experience in a sense as we do? What's the role? Because I suppose when Maddox defines sentience, he says, is he intelligent, is he self-aware, is he conscious? Well, yes, Data has all those things, but if he doesn't have an emotional response, then it's hard for us to understand that, I suppose, because it's so alien to us.
See, I always thought that Data, I know when they probably wrote Data, they didn't intend this, but I always thought that Data is a brilliant example. I know Spock has emotions, and obviously Vulcans have very strong emotions, and they control it with their philosophy, and I would say probably a certain level of mindfulness. But to a certain extent, Spock's a bit like this, and also Data as well. I read years ago an article written by somebody who was on the spectrum for autism and Asperger's syndrome, and he was saying that he identified with Data. And he never really believed that Data didn't feel emotions. He said that Data was too curious not to be emotional. He was his love of music and of art, and there's certain elements of it where he's he's like getting stuff too perfect. He's copying and he's replicating things rather than maybe being the messy, emotional being that a human would be. His constant curiosity about the world and his desire to be more human and to learn, and also to defend and care for the people around him, suggests somebody suggests a sentient being who exhibits at least some sort of low-level kind of emotional connection to the world around them. And he was saying that's very much how he felt as somebody on the autism spectrum, that just because you're not expressing the kinds of emotions that human beings expect to be expressed, and this would go for animals too. They say some of the most animals living the most emotionally rich lives on our planet are like whales and dolphins, dolphins especially, but they're not exhibiting the kind of emotion that we'd expect from another human being. So it'd be very hard to tell the emotion of a dolphin, but it's not so hard for another dolphin. And so that was the sort of I always felt like that Data very much was part of the human world. He just was like a different kind of human, or not a human, but it doesn't mean he couldn't have an active role and self-determining his own future and his own destiny.
Yeah. You brought up a few things. One thing is that I think that we have a much easier time if we can connect to something, if it reminds us of ourselves, then we are much more likely to grant humanoid rights to that being. And so when Data, say, doesn't express emotions, that makes it more difficult for some. He probably, I think I've heard arguments like that, he probably does have some type of emotions even before the emotion chip, he doesn't express them in the same way, but that separates him from people. And so when Pulowski, the second Doctor, second season TNG, came on, she didn't seem to respect Data as a humanoid. And the Doctor, I think a lot of people would, immediately assume that he wasn't like a human or a humanoid, because, he's holographic, and they know holograms as what they're used to on the holodeck, which are, not. I think that if the Doctor is sentient, it comes from kind of emergence from the great complexity of his programming in his mind, And I think the way that sentience probably should have been thought of at the time, which would equate Data to the Doctor, would be that level of complexity, the level of learning, the amount of time that they've been able to learn and sort of create new programs for themselves, new additions to their programming so that they're not just a carbon copy of something else. But instead, the way that people interact is usually how much they can relate to them. So if they can relate to Data more than the Doctor because he looks more like a humanoid, in a sense, because you can throw something through the Doctor sometimes if he turns off his physicality or whatever. So they don't relate to that. So they relate more to Data, perhaps. Although some other people might find the Doctor seems, interacts more like a human because he shows more emotion or whatever. And then, they would choose the Doctor over. But it's this idea of relating to them instead of having a greater understanding of the complexity that they have and the learning and the other things. I mean, that's only one maybe too simplistic way of thinking about it. But if that's where intelligence and perhaps sentience comes from, then we should use that, not relatability.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, actually, there's a line in Measure of a Man where Maddox says something along the lines of, if this was a box on wheels, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
The exocom.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. It's because Data looks human that we kind of imagine that he is human. I mean, I don't know about you, in my house, we have an Amazon Echo in the kitchen, and so you talk to the Echo, you ask it for things, it makes jokes and stuff. I mean, and there's sort of a question about, like, how do you address the Echo, and do you... My partner, for example, said she thought it was important to be polite to the Echo, because not because the Echo is alive, but because it's not good to get into the habit of talking in a rude or sort of fashion to anything, even whether it's alive or not. My son, who's 2, he talks to the Echo, and I have no idea what he thinks. He knows that you say things to it, and it does what you say. Play The Wheels on the Bus, and it will play it. I don't know what he thinks that thing is that responds when he talks to it. He talks to the dogs as well, and they don't talk back to him, obviously. But I mean, it's sort of curious. I wonder whether, for him growing up with this kind of machine that he can talk to, whether that will affect what his feelings are about machines versus humans, about different kinds of entities like that.
So in most cases, and definitely in the case of the Doctor and also in the case of Data, and this does relate to the Echoes, in most cases human rights, and also with humans, in most cases human rights are there to protect people because they're being asked to do something or they're being made to do something that's going to either harm them, damage their future, or something that's going to be uncomfortable, something they don't want to do. And so human rights, we don't put human rights in so that we can be kind to everybody. There's just sort of this idea that we should be kind and respectful to everybody anyway. And that includes a computer. I mean, a computer, at the moment, maybe computers aren't sentient or emotional beings. Although they do say that some computers have the sort of intelligence level, I guess technical level of a 2-year-old. But I mean, if you're going to be hitting your computer and kicking, you're not that too far from kicking a dog. I mean, you should be treating the things around you with respect anyway, even if they're engineered objects or they're the natural world, like a plant. I mean, I talk to my plants. Do my plants understand what I'm saying? No, but when I talk to them, I feed them and I water them. So
they're supposed to grow better as well if you talk to them.
The attention I'm giving to them and the kindness I'm giving to them will ensure they probably will live longer. So
should Chief O'Brien be getting in trouble for kicking the computer when he's having trouble with it? We've decided that the London School of Economics building has obviously become sentient and taken against us. So we've been forced out by a second fire alarm, and we've relocated to a very nice cafe around the corner. So we're going to pick up the conversation here. I was just thinking, I mean, talking about Measure of a Man, one of the things that struck me is that in these Star Trek episodes where there's some kind of question over the rights or the humanity of one of these characters, there's a difference between those that address it in a kind of legal framework and those that address it in a moral framework. And we have, in the Voyager episode Latent Image, there's this kind of moral question about the Doctor, but it's not really put into legal terms. It's only once you get to author that there's this kind of legal framework for it. And similarly, in a way with the exocomps, it's more of a kind of moral thing. There isn't time to set up a kind of legal arrangement there. And I guess in other earlier episodes that we see, Devil in the Dark, the treatment of the creature in that, even in Discovery, the treatment of the tardigrade, there are these kind of moral questions about how do we treat other beings, whether we exploit them or not, but they're not necessarily framed in a legal setup. And obviously Measure of a Man was written by Melinda Snodgrass, who was a lawyer herself by profession before she was a writer. So she brought that kind of legal approach to trying to define these things. And I was quite interested when I was looking into this. I don't know how familiar either of you are with the Dred Scott case. I hadn't heard of this, but obviously in America I got the impression this was quite a big deal, which has a lot of parallels with the Measure of a Man, because it's this slave who basically he'd lived for a period of time in one of the northern states, and therefore in a state where he was kind of recognised as free, I think, and then gone back to a southern state, and he was petitioning to have his freedom recognised, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court in the end, but basically they found against him, and the reason they found against him was they said that as a black slave, he wasn't a citizen of the United States, and therefore he wasn't protected by any of the rights that were afforded to American citizens. He actually didn't have the right to bring a case to court, and so his kind of claim, very much like Data's claim in a sense, was struck down in his case.
Absolutely, and I think that Star Trek, like as I said earlier, is from America originally, and I think a lot of the parallels will be to things like that. I think that was probably, that was probably in the writer's minds at the time, but of course it's happened all around the world, and you have the Jews in Nazi Germany, and whether it's legal or moral, it's essentially the same thing. You're looking at the rights, and if a judge is deciding it, then you'll get a specific answer. But you also get throughout Star Trek moral answers, and a lot of them are based on actual legal Starfleet regulations or Federation regulations. And I think Janeway in Voyager throughout the series does a really good job of bringing the importance in sort of practical terms as well as moral terms, the importance of these moral principles. So, for example, there are times when people have said in Voyager something like, Janeway herself said, I don't know if we can afford Starfleet principles at one time, and Chakotay brings it up at one time, and of course you have the ship, what's the name of the ship?
Equinox.
Yeah, Equinox, where they've abandoned them, but you get in several episodes like The Void, and throughout the series in general, Janeway coming to the conclusion that actually Starfleet principles will be, you can't afford not to follow Starfleet principles. And one of those basic principles is the respecting the rights of other species. And you see that in The Void, respecting the rights of the indigenous aliens within the Void. And of course in the Equinox, you have them not respecting the rights of the alien species they come across in order to use them to try to get home.
And in The Void, she actually pulls up a copy of, I guess it's the Federation Charter, isn't it? I mean, she's going through these legal documents. Same way in The Measure of a Man, actually, Picard is going through legal documents, and in the end he goes to see the judge and he says, I can't make head nor tail, this is gobbledygook to me, this kind of legal jargon, I need your help to sort it out. But there's definitely that kind of reliance on the kind of the legal arrangement. And Janeway, actually, interestingly, in Author, is very aware of this kind of historical precedent. She makes that speech and she invokes this time in the history of, the Federation, the history of America, saying that at a certain time only landowners of a certain race and gender were allowed to have rights. So exactly that idea that came up in this case of this slave, Dred Scott, that, some people were allowed, some people were people and some people were things, essentially. And that's really what happens in The Measure of a Man, is this recognition that, this idea of property. They say that, once you determine that data is property, it's effectively a form of slavery. But that very issue, which Guinan points out, that very issue in the Dred Scott case was one of the things that the lead judge said in his summing up, was basically that these, this we the people, these are not people as far as that document is concerned, these are things. This is, I think he calls them merchandise, an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic is the term term that's used. And so that's precisely the thing, is that, you know, it's no good. I mean, human rights are all very well and good, but if someone isn't being recognised as a human, then it's kind of meaningless.
Right.
So how does that relate to other species in the Star Trek franchise? So there's that very famous line in Star Trek: The Undiscovered Country, the film, where I think it's Chancellor Gowron's daughter, whose name I cannot remember.
Azekbor.
That's a catchy name. She says something like, you know, human rights, you know, even in the name,
right.
You know, they are. It's like racist.
The very name is racist.
The very name is racist. Yeah. And then at some point, one of the Klingons says "present company excluded" when he's referring to Spock, because obviously Spock isn't completely human.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I thought was very interesting in doing the research for this podcast was how so different and so varied the different species and the different worlds' ideas of what rights were, you know, humanoid rights, shall we say, or alien rights. In some countries, like in today's world, some worlds and some cultures allow the death penalty, allow torture, and other countries and other unions don't. So there's a situation like with the European Convention of Human Rights outlaws torture, and everybody who signs up to that and is part of the European Union has to actually agree to not have torture, or the death penalty is another example there. But in the Federation, you know, there are cultures like Bajor has the death penalty, for instance. In the episode Duet, when they think they have a Cardassian war criminal, they're talking about executing him. So Bajor, he was found guilty. Bajor has the death penalty. At that point, Bajor is part of the Federation, but you wonder did they have to give up their right to execute people in order to become part of the Federation. And what it seems like is the Federation isn't massively brilliant at imposing those universal rights across the universe. I mean, like in the episode The Cloudminders in the original series, they visit a world where there's massive human rights abuses going on. And I'm not sure Kirk and Spock seem all that massively concerned. What did you think of that? Like in the conjunction with today's world, where we have these treaties we sign up to that we all promise to abide by, but then obviously some countries don't do that. In contrast with the Star Trek world, where the Federation's got these very specific human rights rules. But other cultures and worlds don't.
And what happens if you have, you know, say a rogue Federation planet who are doing something? I mean, Bajor, you're right, is not part of the Federation, so that's kind of different. But what happens if an individual Federation planet turns? Well, there's the Kodos the Executioner. That was a Federation world, wasn't it? And obviously he went a bit, you know, crazy or whatever, and you know, started doing things that would completely violate those rights. You know, on most of these different rights conventions is the right to life, and he just starts executing people to try and solve his food shortage. I mean,
I think that you have like people going rogue, sort of not often, but it comes up quite a few times, especially when it's something like of the moment like that, when someone just suddenly makes a decision because of a crisis or whatever, and does that, and that might pass, and that might be down to that one person. But I think you probably also have that, as you say, I don't think the Federation imposes these laws that much. I don't think they go around and make sure that everyone is following the rules. I think it's probably when they accept someone into the Federation as a Federation member, they do a big study of that. We know it's you know, takes a long time for them to look at Bajor to decide whether Bajor is ready for Federation membership, and you get the sense that, you know, every time someone's going to join, and you see it in TNG quite a few times as well, they do a survey, they do an extensive bit of research into that planet for a while before deciding to accept them, and then going forward after that, I think it's kind of you know, based on what's the term, you know, where you allow them to, you sort of trust them to follow through, you know, you just accept them to follow the rules, and you don't really check up on it because you've decided that they were ready to become a Federation member, so they're ready to be trustworthy. And obviously, then there will be some that end up turning sour after that. I mean, if you have a democratic system, someone else might come to power on that planet and change the way that things work. And then I suppose at that point they have to be looked at again. But they know they're going to lose Federation membership if they screw up. So maybe that keeps people in line a bit.
And then there's also the other situation where the Federation has to deal with races and worlds that aren't part of the Federation, like Cardassia. Or I was thinking in the Voyager episode Repentance, where they come across that ship of prisoners who are being held prisoner by these prison guards, and they have to just kind of put up with the human rights abuses, even though it goes completely against Starfleet's philosophy, it goes completely against what the Federation rules. And Cardassians is a great example. On Deep Space Nine, the Federation are there almost like sort of semi-objective observers, and the Cardassians are still committing massive human rights abuses throughout the entire series. Are you thinking about like Garrick torturing Odo, or some of the stuff that Gul Dukat does when he has occupation of the station, imprisoning Lita and imprisoning Rom. I was like, Nog? No, that's not Rom. And
the intention is to execute Rom as well.
Yeah.
I mean, the Cardassians are, I suppose,
they did kind of, what they did was sort of would be seen as traitorous or whatever. What I think is more disturbing, actually, is how they sort of stood and watched from the sidelines when Cardassia was occupying Bajor. And of course, the idea is, the Prime Directive, and you don't want to intervene, and when, you could make things worse. And obviously, we can see when America goes and tries to supposedly spread democracy, it can be a complete disaster. But to kind of just not even, I don't think they really helped Bajor that much. I don't know. I mean, obviously, maybe that's the right thing to do, just to stay out of the way. But it is disturbing when you think about it that the Federation was right there, so powerful, and just watching as what Cardassia actually did to the Bajorans. And then after, of course, they're going to help Bajor, and they're not accepting Cardassia into the Federation. But is that enough?
And I mean, the Cardassians, I think, in the whole of Star Trek, are the kind of quintessential human rights abusers, really. I mean, almost probably if you went through all the rights that you've got on one of those documents, you'd find they break pretty much all of them. I mean, famously, when Captain Picard was captured by the Cardassians and tortured, torture obviously is something that, although occasionally, we do see Archer crossing that line, we do sort of see Janeway slightly crossing that line, but broadly speaking, that is completely outlawed in the Federation. Cardassians view that as a completely legitimate, normal aspect of interrogation. The right to a fair trial, the Cardassian justice system is kind of Kafkaesque. It's this absurd setup where basically guilt is already presumed. One of the rights in these documents is the presumption of innocence and the right to a trial before you're punished. So in all these different respects, the Cardassians basically trample all over what we would consider human rights. I don't think they have fair elections even. They don't have, everything in that society is kind of, it is more like, say, North Korea, or it is more like, countries that we have in the real world where there are rights abuses, whether it's, stoning women in the Middle East, or it's, a country like a totalitarian regime like North Korea or somewhere like that. That's the kind of model we have there. And I suppose when Clara was asking, what does it mean to say that they're human rights, and obviously in Star Trek 6 there's that line about it being racist, and are human rights just for humans? And that comes up in Enterprise as well, because I think in the episode Cogenitor, Trip makes a point about the Cogenitor's human rights, and someone, it might be T'Pol, corrects him and says they're not human, you can't impose that on them. At the same time, I think Star Trek does have this view, also going back to the Undiscovered Country, Kirk has that line, everybody's human, and that's the kind of Star Trek view, is that really these human rights should be extended to all beings, essentially, whether they're technically human or not. They're human as far as we're concerned.
Says they're universal.
Yeah.
Kirk always tries to call everyone human, thinking it's a compliment, even though he's insulting people.
But that's kind of, Star Trek is quite unique amongst science fiction franchises because of the fact that so many of the aliens in Star Trek are humanoid. Star Trek is very much about the human question the human experience, the human drive, and a quest to make the world better. A lot of science fiction shows or science fiction films have aliens that are more
alien,
otherworldly. Like I'm thinking of the film Arrival.
Yeah.
I mean, how would you even be able to sort of deal with the rights of a creature that has a completely different concept of time? Time isn't linear for the aliens in Arrival. It's not like it is for us. So
we get the wormhole aliens.
It's not linear for the prophets. Yeah. And I mean, and there is some questions about like the rights of who gets to go through the wormhole and how people use the wormhole. Are you going to let like warships go through the wormhole? Is that really what the prophets would want? It's hard to know what the prophets would want. Prophets inhabit humanoid bodies. One of the things that really struck me as interesting about the Cardassians, which when you were talking about them, is that they commit human rights abuses in much the same way that many regimes over history have committed human rights abuses, which is that they see it as defending or supporting or furthering on or building their own culture or their own community. So it's very clear the Cardassians were once a peaceful, spiritual people, and then of course the army took over, probably like in some sort of coup, you can imagine, from like a provisional government or civilian government or whatever. And that's because there was massive starvation. So the Cardassian who tortures Picard talks about having this horrific childhood where he had to fight for food, and he was, constantly, his life was constantly under threat. So this isn't excusing their human rights abuses at all, but in the Cardassians' minds, they don't see them as human rights abuses. They don't see it as abuse. They see it as like, we have the right to have a healthy, well-fed population. We don't have the natural resources. Bajor does. They're not managing their natural resources well enough. We can do it better if we just take some of it, And then, like, as you said, that just kind of spirals out of control into absolute horrendous, like a genocide, basically. And you're right. When Cisco first arrived on Deep Space Nine, Kira is furious. She doesn't want the Federation there. They don't want another set of masters. And you can imagine she'd be furious because, yeah, you're right. Where were the Federation during the time where she and everyone she knew was growing up in refugee camps?
Right.
Well, I think the Cardassians, they have a combination of, firstly, this kind of obsessive nationalism. So they've got this, it's all about Cardassia. It's all about, doing things for the betterment of Cardassia, whatever that means for anyone else. And also this kind of colonial attitude of they can go to another planet and exploit their resources. And Descartes says in the episode Waltz, he says, we were the superior race. Basically, we had the right to take these things from you because we are better than you. And that is very much the kind of attitude that underpins the establishment of the slave trade, this idea that, maybe these people are human, but they're not human the way we're human, they're not the same as us. They're kind of lesser beings, and therefore it's legitimate to exploit them. And, really that's what a lot of these rights come down to, is the kind of, they're basically different freedoms, aren't they? But they're freedoms from different forms of exploitation.
Yeah, and I wanted to say that's why I think you both explain the Cardassians really well, and that's why I don't think they're very much like North Korea. I think they're more like fascist or imperialist, maybe somewhere between kind of a feudal kind of version of a society and a more like Mussolini / sometimes Hitler style fascist society of the modern age. And it's interesting because they had ancient contact with the ancient Bajorans, and I think the Bajorans were more technologically advanced but also more spiritual and just a very different culture. And then the Cardassians did go through some tough times and they had definitely a history of a very artistic and high culture society at one point, and then they did kind of degenerate more into what they became. But it's interesting is you get this defense of Cardassia as a justification for what they do. You also get from the guy who was pretending to be the butcher of Galatap, but wasn't. But you can tell that the lines that he's speaking are, the kind of the lines that he got from those in power at the camp, from maybe the butcher of Galatap himself. And he says, Kira says, well, yeah, I killed Cardassians, but because I was fighting for Bajor. and obviously she meant, in terms of they were oppressing the Bajorans, and she was fighting for they were fighting for their lives. And he responds, oh yeah, we were fighting for Cardassia, and he gives this kind of speech about what that meant. But I also wanted to jump in on Garrick is another interesting source of information about the Cardassians, and you get some of their literature in his discussions with Julian. You get an understanding of their belief in working for the state, lifetime after lifetime of working for the state, and so on. And there's also a discussion or a comment actually from Garrick where it's from Garrick, and he says that when they're fighting in like a battle, he says you must admit, interrogation chamber would be better. You must admit it's much more civilized, and I think that is totally wrong, and I think that it depends on how you define civilized, but I think civilized has to be about the kind of society that respects rights and that has things like democracy and like a conversation between all of the people that out of which emerges a society that everyone can accept and everyone can be respected in and stuff. And I think the interrogation chamber, especially as we see it from Cardassians, is the opposite of everything civilized. And that's, I think, kind of what happens to a culture like Cardassia. It used to have this high art and probably was very civilized, but because they've stopped respecting people's rights, and so you can get even yelling at a computer or yelling at a dog or treating animals badly starts to create this culture. And ultimately, if you're willing to violate the rights of other sentient beings of any type, you're increasing, have slavery, and so on in the extreme, you're losing your civilization.
Although interestingly, the Cardassians do, one element which they do share in common with, say, the Nazis in the Second World War, and maybe not with North Korea, as you were pointing out, is that idea of they're cultural snobs, for a start. They believe in high culture. They also, even in the episode where Picard is being tortured, the torturer has his daughter. He talks about, the importance of family. They're kind to children. I don't know if the Cardassians are kind to animals necessarily, but, the same thing you'd see sometimes with Nazis in the Second World War, kindness to animals, kindness to children, and so on, and yet unspeakable cruelty to other groups of people. And it's that idea, that's one of the things I think is so chilling about the Cardassians, is that they do want to talk about art and literature. They do demonstrate gestures of kindness. They do occasionally, even someone like Gul Dukat occasionally does something that we sort of like him for. Do you know what I mean? He has a few good qualities in there, and I think that makes them more interesting in some ways.
Sure, but they have lost a lot of their culture. The literature that Garrick talks about, it very much feels like bordering on just propaganda. I'm sure it is good literature, and I'm sure all of that, but it is, generation after generation of duty to the state and so on, and that's their high form of literature now, and I think it has been heavily influenced by the way that the society has become much more centralized and dictatorial. And you have the Secret Service that knows what you've eaten for breakfast and so on, and I think that gets fed into the literature. You had in the Soviet Union a time when you couldn't, if you wrote anything that didn't conform to these ideals that they had, you wouldn't, it would be not just censored, but you might also be sent to the Gulag for writing it. And you have the sense that in Cardassia, you probably have some of that influencing the way that the literature goes. And what I mean by losing culture, you also, and you do have, we know, the doctor in Voyager, the doctor who they recreated the hologram of the doctor, and he was not only giving diseases to Bajorans, but he was also sacrificing many animals in terrible ways, and he didn't care about the alien that they were actually trying to save. He only cared about saving B'Elanna's life. You have the sense that this cruelty is, it affects a lot of parts of the culture. Yeah, sure, they still love their children. You'd be very hard-pressed to find any, no matter how bad system or regime, where people don't still love their children. Yeah. Even if their children are raised by the state, which is a little bit different. But, everyone, you always love the children. That doesn't change. But everything else, you get the sense, has been affected by this shift in Cardassia, and I do think that it's not, they've lost their sense of civilization and culture.
I think one of the problems is that it doesn't really matter how cultured a society is. I mean, we live in a very cultured society, but we have the Human Rights Act, and we have that to protect our human rights. It doesn't matter if we're educated or we read books or we have enough to eat or we abide by traffic laws. We need to have the human rights because there's always going to be someone who's willing to violate them, who's willing to take somebody and make them a stereotype or and then because they are a stereotype, they'd be able to treat them badly or use them for some nefarious purpose that they didn't sign up for. And I'm thinking of the example of the Cardassian torturing Picard. He talks about his daughter. He's obviously a very cultured man. He's an educated man. But when he starts the real serious torture of Picard, he stops referring to him as captain. He stops referring to him as Picard. He calls him human. And throughout DS9, the Cardassians refer to Bajorans as Bajorans, or they say, they refer derogatively to a single Bajoran as Bajoran. They shout it, and you can see as throughout Star Trek actually, when an alien or a species wants to make another species or another alien seem less, to dismiss them, to potentially treat them badly. They call them by their species name, like Taxian or Vulcan, or and actually in Star Trek on Vulcan, like calling Spock a half-breed or calling Amanda, his mother, like a human whore. They're not. It's inconceivable that any of Spock's school colleagues, school buddies, school classmates wouldn't have known who Amanda was. They know who she is, they know her name, but they're not going to call her Amanda the wife of the ambassador, because that's making her a person, giving her respect. They're going to call her a human whore. And that's something that you see throughout history. Like, the Nazis didn't want Jews to be people. It's harder to kill people. It's hard to kill individuals. It's hard to kill people who have families or identities or interests or hobbies. You want to dehumanize them. You want to make them objects. You want to make them Jews. You want to make them vermin. And in some of the cases, we see this in our own culture when people talk about immigration. They refer to refugees as swarms of refugees, making them seem like insects. And if they seem like insects, it's easier to infringe their human rights and treat them badly.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I suppose for the Cardassians, maybe it's easier to abuse the rights of other beings if you see them as less than yourself. Although they do presumably abuse the rights of their own citizens as well, if they feel that they're dissidents or whatever. But for the Federation, having established this idea of treating all species equally, of treating all species with respect, then there's this kind of interesting question which we see, particularly in Deep Space Nine, we talked earlier about what happens when you're at war. What are the circumstances where these rights suddenly become kind of provisional? I mean, in Deep Space Nine, there's that episode with the title is the quotation from Cicero, "Inter arma enim silent leges," in times of war, the laws fall silent. And that's very much a theme that we see, both in Star Trek and in the real world. After 9/11, we had these concepts. We had the idea of enhanced interrogation, which is a euphemism for torture. We had the idea of extraordinary rendition. We have these kind of bizarre, sort of convoluted phrases which try to sort of get around the fact that we are basically pushing some of these rights that people have fought for and that have been encoded in law out the window. We're finding ways to get around them in a sense. And we see that in Star Trek as well. We see instances where people cross the line, where Archer tortures someone, where people break their own rules because they feel they have to, because they have, no choice or whatever. But we also see situations where, I suppose in insurrection, for example, the Federation is committing what is clearly a human rights violation against the Baku, and doing it knowingly, really, because they've decided that, it's justified in that instance because they're going to profit from it. They're not really any different from the Cardassians in that respect.
Right, but hopefully you get the sense sense that this is only a few people that go renegade. And you say, it doesn't matter how cultured you are, because, you need the human or humanoid rights in order to stop certain people. There will always be certain people who will break the rule, and that's right. But hopefully in the Federation, it's only a few. It's those few renegade people, and you need those rights to protect those few, and you need those rights to help the culture continue to be what it is. But I do think that it is largely the culture that produces the people who are more or less likely to violate human rights. And so you have to, you need laws and you need things to begin to get the culture to move in that direction, and you need, public conversation, and you need trials that come out the right way, not the wrong way, obviously, and grant rights to everyone. But going forward, then you build a culture that does most of the work of making sure that people treat each other well, and you only need to rely on those laws in certain instances. And when it comes to wartime, those do often, that is when these things go out of the window or get even worse. But one thing I wanted to mention is something that we do today on Earth, and that I think I remember happening in a few instances in Star Trek. Maybe you can help me remember when they happened. Basically, there's the Prime Directive, and so you have to follow other people's laws. But what about instances, and maybe Cisco might have done something like this, or I can't remember who, where the Federation officer sort of took advantage of the fact, Archer certainly threatens it, of taking advantage of the fact that another society has less protection for rights, and so therefore either threatens or actually sends someone to that place so that they would torture or they would execute or whatever. So you get America sometimes
like
wanting
threatening to extradite someone to the Klingons. We see that in the Pale Moonlight, I think, don't we? That's the threat that's levelled over the guy who's going to forge the holographic clip. Is, well, you're wanted by the Klingons. If we hand you over to them, they're going to do unspeakable things to you that the Federation will not.
Doesn't Cisco task Garrick with basically getting the Romulans into the war?
Yeah.
Yes.
Because Cisco can't do it himself.
Unofficially.
Right.
I mean, but it is
31.
sanctioned, isn't it? Because it is actually sanctioned by Starfleet, what he does, even if it's kind of slightly off the book.
Which is not a good thing, and Cisco's not necessarily happy with that. And you have Section 31, which there's a great line, I think Odo says it, about, isn't it a convenient arrangement where you can hold up your you can be on the high moral ground, and Section 31 will do all the dirty work, and you can pretend you don't know about it, essentially. So I think this is one of the first steps before you actually go ahead and change your human rights law, your humanoid rights laws, and throw out everyone's rights. Before that, you might extradite to someone who's to some place that's worse, or have them do it, or have Garrick do it, or have Section 31 do it.
Or in the case of the UK, you have planes during the height of war on terror. I say the height; it's never really ended, but during the time where the Guantanamo Bay was at its height, you were having planes with detainees flying through British airspace and sometimes landing at British airports to be refueled. And Britain itself wasn't supposed to be sanctioning this kind of torture. Well, you could argue, well, Britain isn't sanctioning the torture, but they're allowing Americans to use their airports, use their fuel, and to use their airspace, knowing full well that anyone who lands here and takes off again is going to go and be tortured somewhere else.
It's a convenient arrangement.
It's a convenient arrangement, yeah.
So I wonder, are there any other, just looking at this various human rights legislation, are there any other articles or any other kind of rights that maybe we haven't touched on yet that could be relevant to Star Trek?
So there was one that I thought maybe we could talk about just briefly, which is the right to privacy. And the reason why I wanted to bring this up, I wanted to pose this question, was because and watching the series, Deep Space Nine, but also actually watching Next Generation as well, I noticed that most Starfleet ships or Federation stations are fitted with extensive computer libraries, computer data banks, and it almost seems like anytime anybody wants any information on anybody, they can look it up and they can find it. And the information gets shared very freely between different organizations, between Starfleet, between the Bajoran, the Bajoran government, Odo continually seems to have a data bank of all the information that he ever needs to know. And I wondered, how does this work in terms of the right to privacy? So is everyone's information being stored centrally somewhere, and does anyone have access to it?
I wonder how much of that is what we would consider public information today, and how much of it is more private. So, you can find out where I've worked and probably even where I've lived, which maybe we shouldn't have that so available, but that's pretty easily available today, and for the most part things like that we don't mind so much, but maybe how much money I have in my bank account, or things like that we might consider more private today, and certainly my medical records, there's a big question of that today. So yeah, I wonder in the Federation, do they have the same understanding of what should be public and private, and do people have the option of making things public or keeping them private? And in the case of Odo, he certainly has violated the rules of the Federation, and he's not working for the Federation really. He's supposedly a Bajoran security officer in a way, although the way that it works on the space station is a bit confusing because it's sort of both. But he's not Starfleet for sure, and he has broken the rules. He's got Sisko angry at him and so forth, and he spies on Quark, and that's probably not that probably is against the rules. But he says it's best for the station, so he does it anyway. So whether he accesses things that people would rather have private because he finds some backdoor in, because he has a lot of Cardassian friends that help him out with backdoors and stuff like that. So I don't know. But Starfleet officers are going to, all of their basic information is going to be available to Starfleet for the most part, at least in a sort of hierarchical sense, where maybe there are things classified at the top. Or there are things classified in general, but everything else is pretty much available to Starfleet officers. But regular Federation citizens, could you find out everything that you wanted to about Sisko Senior? Or would he be able to, he could very, very stubbornly say, no, it's my rights. He's very proud of his rights as a Federation citizen, as we see in Homefront. So, he's very proud of that, and so I'm sure if he wanted to keep things secret, he probably could, and he would probably demand it, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that's true. It's hard to be sure, because obviously in all the series, we're seeing Starfleet, we're seeing kind of military setup where obviously your rights to things like privacy are probably limited to some extent compared to an ordinary citizen. I guess what we see, over and over again in the shows is the comm badge is this kind of symbolic emblem of your lack of privacy in a sense. And if someone wants to do something that they don't want people to know about, they take their comm badge off and leave it on the floor, and then suddenly they're off the grid, and magically, which is slightly implausible in a way.
They go off to have sex.
Right? Yeah. Exactly. That's your kind of privacy screen. In a sense. Yeah.
Not to be bothered.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know whether that affects it, that we're seeing people in essentially a military environment, and someone like Mr. Sisko on Earth is living in a different environment. But then that episode that you talk about, Homefront, of course, is the episode where we see this real kind of clampdown. We see martial law being imposed. We see all these, and this whole debate about, does someone have the right to refuse a blood screening, for example, if they see that as an infringement of their rights.
It's obviously a very exceptional circumstance, a very exceptional moment when they think they're getting invaded, and they have some evidence to think that they're getting invaded by the Dominion, and changelings are everywhere on Earth. And even then, within, I forget how long it exactly takes, but within a certain amount of time, weeks or whatever, they realize that nothing's happened yet. They realize that there was someone that went rogue again in Starfleet, and get rid of the guy who went rogue, and get rid of all of the martial law. And at the end, Odo says, "Aren't you still scared?" And Sisko Senior, whatever, says, yeah, of course we're still concerned, but we're not going to give up our rights for this. And I think that's, there are moments, and there are rogue people, but hopefully overall the Federation is not going to violate people's privacy and use martial law and all of that stuff in general. I wanted to bring up something, which is, we've been talking about rights a lot, but we haven't really made a distinction that we are talking about individual rights. there is also such a thing as rights for a society, and you can have, a society can become quite authoritarian and quite like Cardassia if you only care about the state and the rights of the overall society. But there are times when you do want to grant rights to a society, such as when you use the Prime Directive to stay away from a society, to say they have the right to evolve on their own. And like there's a Voyager episode called Natural Law, and you have and in that one they want to grant the rights of a society to stay completely protected and away from everyone, but not just with the Prime Directive, but they actually have an alien has created a force field around them. And so this is kind of representative of like an indigenous kind of old tribal society or something somewhere where, and you might have invaders, like the Americans going to invade America and the latter-day Americans, and potentially by accident or on purpose wiping out the indigenous population and so forth. But you also have in Star Trek, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, and you have a lot of discussion of things where you do respect a group and not just an individual. So I guess my question is, in terms of this discussion of rights, how much is this all about individual rights, and how much do we have to sort of look at rights in a slightly broader context and where there might be something beyond just individual rights that we're talking about? Thoughts?
So I think the problem with that is that, and it might sound kind of controversial for our listeners, but I personally think that the rights of the individual are different depending on which society you live in. So American rights seem much more individualistic to me than British rights. As a society, I feel that Britain is less concerned with individual freedom in the same way that America is concerned with individual freedom. So, for instance, you don't always get to choose who's going to operate on you in the UK, but everybody has the right to an operation. I know that some operations are not covered by the NHS, but the majority of operations, especially when it comes to preserving your life and your health, are covered by the NHS. So you don't have the right to choose who's going to operate on you, but everybody gets. Exactly. Everybody gets the right to an operation. Whereas in the US, obviously this is all in flux at the moment with the current administration, but you get to choose your own surgeon, but it means that maybe people living down the road from you don't actually have the right to have the operation that they need because they can't afford it, or it's something that's not covered by their insurance plan or whatever.
Well, it's not considered a right, so it would be an individual right if it was considered a right, but it's not considered a right.
Yeah.
So the thing is, I can explain the reasons if you want. Not that I agree with them,
but just that, the words, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. When you're making legislation, you've got to think about a law that's going to be able to benefit a huge number of people, as many people as possible, as opposed to a small group of people. And unfortunately, often the people who are making laws are often a small group of people, and in lots of societies, they are sometimes wealthier, they are members of upper classes, often have had more opportunities from birth, and are more educated, so technically it's quite possible they are going to make rights that are going to benefit the few rather than the many. I mean, you would hope morally they would see it as their duty to make rights that would rights that benefit everybody. So I think if you've got a question when Star Trek was made and how it was made by, Star Trek primarily has been made by Americans. So individual self-determination, individual rights is very important in Star Trek. But there's also this kind of, I would say, go as far as saying perhaps a slightly socialist message of Star Trek as well, which is that collectively we're stronger than we are on our own, and sometimes you have to do what's best for the group over what's best for the individual, and sometimes those two things clash. What's best for the individual clashes with what's best for the group, and sometimes the individual has to sacrifice what they want so the group can get everybody can have what they need.
But you don't want to.
That clashes sometimes with American culture.
But I mean, also I think. Well, it's interesting that you say that, because then you have, I was just thinking the best of both worlds. You have Picard going up against the Borg, and he says, my culture is based on freedom and self-determination. I mean, that sounds like a very American especially coming out of an English actor's mouth. It sounds very much like the kind of
don't
American
believe in freedom and
individualistic.
self-determination here.
I'm not saying I don't believe in it, but I'm just saying I think it's an interesting point. Whereas you're saying they also believe in a sort of a form of collectivism, obviously not the Borg collectivism, but a kind of a more benign version of that, maybe. But I think it's true. Even just thinking about other rights in these kind of conventions that we have. The right to freedom of speech is something. We have a right to freedom of speech. They have one in America, but the right to freedom of speech in America goes further to the extent that in England, say, we have libel laws which operate, maybe not strictly enough, but they operate certainly more strictly than whatever the equivalent is. I don't even know what the equivalent is in the States, but in the States you can get away with saying things that here you would get in a lot of trouble for saying about people.
Freedom of speech is enshrined.
Exactly.
As a very.
It's sort of almost without compromise, whereas I think over here there's a recognition that yes, we believe in the principle of freedom of speech, but there are instances, hate speech, for example, there are kind of instances where freedom of speech can have limits placed on it without fundamentally taking it away from people.
I think Americans, the culture is that when something is very important, when a right is very important, you can't compromise it. There's this idea that there's a slippery slope, or that if you compromise it a little, you're compromising it completely. Is this idea that there's an ideal and it's got to be respected, I think, but there and maybe this also makes it more difficult for people to compromise, in public discussion and in terms of finding laws and regulations that even though there might be some bad that could come out of it, doesn't mean you throw out the whole thing. Like a minimum wage law. Well, it might cause unemployment even amongst the population you're trying to help, but is there any way to get around that? And here you have, so these minimum wages apply to these people and these apply to those people, in terms of age especially. And that's one way to avoid causing unemployment amongst the people you're trying to help. You have a slightly lower wage for people who are more likely to only be able to get a job at that wage. So you don't get as much compromise in America. But the idea that, sometimes an individual has to sacrifice for the group, I think one of the problems with that is that if you take that, too much as a given, then you might end up having a situation where you literally sacrifice the individual, you let the individual die or something to help the group. And that's when you start to have that corruption of culture that we were talking about before, I think, where you end up turning into Cardassia or something like that. If you sacrifice the individual, and you get that in a lot of, when you have a revolution, when you have, communism or something, and that believes in communism is, it was supposed to be a system that was good for the people, for the workers, and so forth, but you had this willingness to sacrifice an individual for the collective and for the ideal. And so that's why I think also Americans are so hung up on individual rights. And in Star Trek, you have the idea that the group matters, but you also have definitely the idea that the individual matters, and that you are not allowed to sacrifice the individual for the good of the group unless that individual chooses to do so. And you have a lot of people risking their own life to save the group, but you're not supposed to go ahead and sacrifice an individual in order to save the group.
No, it's a personal choice.
Right.
Yeah, they make a personal choice to do that.
And choice, I suppose, is the key thing. That's sort of what we've come back to again and again. That's what Data was trying to fight for. That's the kind of, in a sense, that's the sort of fundamental right that really, a lot of these conversations are about. It's the right to choose, and that's the, that's the most important thing. Well, it's been great talking about human rights here today, both at the London School of Economics and in a random cafe around the corner. But before we go, why don't the two of you tell our listeners where they can find you, whether on the Trek FM network or elsewhere on the internet? Clara, why don't you go first?
So you can find me on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC. I'll just say that again because it's quite loud here. That's at ClaraJeanMC. So if you had any ideas about this podcast and you wanted to chat, please do send me a message on Twitter.
And Guinevere.
Okay, I'm on the Babel conference a lot, and I also have a podcast on Trek FM called The Briar Patch. So you can find me on the Babel conference. My name is Guinevere, and I have Guinevere42 is my Twitter, but I'm on Facebook a lot more than I'm on Twitter. And please listen to The Briar Patch sometime if you find my random thoughts interesting.
It's a great new show. I'm really enjoying it. It's good to have that added to the Trek FM stable. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me, you can find me on Twitter at Barrett's Books, or you can find me in the Babel Conference as well. Well, it's been fun talking about human rights this week, but that's not the only thing we've been talking about on Trek FM, so here's a listen to some of the other things you might have missed out on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, the 602 Club.
Oh, huge. Tintin, definitely in Europe and in many, many other countries, in Africa and Asia, is really, honestly, as big as James Bond rolled together with Indiana Jones and Superman.
The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
First of all, it very much hinges on the existence of subspace, which is also a kind of murky sci-fi term that is used in Star Trek to explain how warp drive works and how you can communicate.
The orb.
And so it makes the relationship between Nog and Jake really important, because I think it does really soften Sisko's heart towards the Ferengi. And I think it does the same thing for Rom. Rom, I think, begins to see the ways in which these Federation types actually are different than most Ferengi to kind of think of them.
Warp 5.
I like to talk about these things. They're not easy to talk about. You know, this is not an easy discussion to have because of so much stuff that's going on in our society right now. You know, and what's been going on for years. You know, again, that hashtag, the Me Too, like, it really opened my eyes, you know, and which is what it was supposed to do, right? It's exactly what it was supposed to do.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out all of these shows and join in the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And please do leave us a star rating and a written review at the same time. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. If you'd also like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/trekfm, that's patreon.com/trekfm, to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, the Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/trekfm. Duncan and I would love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to get involved and do just that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, Babel, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. You can find Duncan and I on the Babel Conference as well, and you can find us both on Twitter, Duncan at Barrett's Books, and myself, Tony, at Black Hole Media. And you can also find me hosting my own podcast, the Xcast and X-Files podcast, if you type that into Twitter and Facebook. So thanks everyone for listening to this episode of Primitive Culture. We'll be back soon to discuss more history, culture, and how Star Trek relates to it.
You're blended all right.